Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I'd like to say on the one hand, it's nice to see Senator Carper acting as my ranking member, but the circumstances are unfortunate to say the least. Senator McCaskill's husband is in the ICU, and so Senator McCaskill is with him in Missouri. So we certainly want to send them our thoughts and prayers, and for Claire, for Joe, and for their family members as well.
I just mentioned to our chairman, I texted with Claire last night to see how he's doing. Apparently, he had a massive heart attack, very serious heart attack, and he had I think it was an internal defibrillator that may have saved his life. And there's still blockages to worry about, and I think some additional surgery work that needs to be done. But so to what the chairman said, let's keep him in our thoughts and prayers.
Thank you. I also want to thank our witnesses, not only for being here for your testimony and for what you're about to answer in terms of our questions, but really for the last 2.5 months. I've been to FEMA's response center. I've talked to the men and women that are working with you. I think doing an extraordinary job, working 12-hour shifts, 7 days in a row for literally weeks, months on end. So this has been unprecedented. Starting back in late August with Harvey, and then Irma, and then Maria, within literally a span of 30 days. We just have not seen anything like this, and I think it's pretty heartening, really. After Katrina, the lessons learned, a lot of those lessons have been put into place and used to rather great effect. But when you have hurricanes and disasters of this magnitude, you can't just snap your fingers and make it all well again. This is going to be a recovery effort that's going to go on for years. But I think the response, and I think we'll hear that in testimony today, has really been quite extraordinary. Nothing's ever perfect. You can always have continuous improvement. But again, I think the men and women that work with you in all of your agencies really need to be commended. And I think in terms of your management of them also needs to be commended as well. So again, I thank you, and I think this committee thanks you as well. This will be what I consider first in a series of hearings. It really, from my standpoint, started with the high-risk hearing when I asked Inspector General Roth to take a look at the problems in FEMA grant lending, how we spend money in emergency situations, what kind of controls, and Inspector General Roth responded very quickly, June 2nd, a letter to me, made a number of recommendations which we have turned into a piece of draft legislation working with Senator McCaskill, also Senator Janes, anybody else on this committee want to start working with us on that. We've been talking to appropriators on how to potentially marry that with some of the emergency funding requests, the supplemental funding requests that we're passing here. We're spending a lot of money, and it needs to be controlled, and I think the issue with whitefish, I'm sure we'll get into that, is just Exhibit A of how careful we need to be in terms of how we spend the taxpayers' hard-earned money. I'm hoping, and I've seen, certainly with Director Long's testimony, we do need to review and lay out FEMA's proper role within the emergency management response. It's a subordinate role. If we can quick put up the chart there, wherever our chart is, there we go. And everybody has this as well. This is just a history. This is put together, I think, by the Heritage Foundation. It only goes up to 2011. It just shows the history of FEMA declarations of emergencies. And it's really striking. Back in the 50s, there were somewhere between 7 and 18 a year. In 2011, high water mark, 242 federal disaster declarations or FEMA declarations. There are a number of reasons for that. Certainly, we continue to build. We have that moral hazard. We continue to build and rebuild in flood zones and hurricane zones, and property values are increasing dramatically. But I think more and more often states are looking to the federal government to do what I believe was probably more suited toward state and local response. As a result, it puts a great deal of stress on federal disaster resources, and certainly FEMA, and I'm sure Director Long, you have felt some of that pressure over the last couple of days. So I think it's appropriate for this committee long term to really take a look at what is the proper balance between state and local response and the federal response in these situations. From my standpoint, as much as we can rely on the state in terms of preparation, standing up those emergency centers and the response before these disasters occur, the better off we're all going to be. So I want to make sure we're talking a little bit about that during the hearing. I did go down to Puerto Rico. I was down there on the 7th, about 2.5 weeks afterwards. I will say that my initial response, having flown over, low-flying helicopter over about a quarter to a third of the island, I was first relieved that the property damage was not as extensive as I was expecting it to be. Now, there's no doubt about it. There's devastation. There's property totally destroyed, but I'd seen pictures of St. Martin. And then just the basic stats, 2.5 weeks, 22 of the 23 ports have been opened. More than 70% of both gas stations and grocery stores were already open. A third of the roads were open, but as we flew over, it looked like in excess of 90% were clear, but obviously blocked in certain choke points. Cell phone companies responded pretty appropriately, kind of shared the burden, cordoned off the island, fixed each other's towers. So it'll be interesting to hear to what percent the cell phone service is back and operational. All 72 of the municipalities back then were already accessible by road. So the logistics problem was being eased. But the biggest problem was, at that point in time, only 12% of the electrical power had been brought back online. And so I returned convinced, and I think I continue to be convinced, that the primary problem long-term now with Puerto Rico, and even before the disaster, was their power grid. It was weak. It was fragile before the hurricane, and now it's offline. It's a very complex problem trying to reestablish and maintain the balance of the electrical grid. And we're going to be spending an awful lot of money, and from my standpoint, that's got to be controlled. And what money we spend, hopefully, can be spent in a manner that we create a more resilient electrical grid that will power a vibrant economy in Puerto Rico for generations to come. My last point is I've been in contact with the chairman of the Financial Oversight Management Board, and I just received an email or a text from him last night, and they met. And I'm just going to quick read you the text. I'll enter into the record. The Federal Oversight Board unanimously has asked for a Chief Transformation Officer to take over the administration of the Power Authority in order to reestablish power as quickly as possible. But moreover, we must transform the energy sector and ensure lower cost, more reliable power. In order to do that, we have to depoliticize the authority, open it up to competition in order to attract private capital. Puerto Rico does not want to return to D.C. with hat in hand in the future. The person the board has named is a retired Air Force colonel who has organizational and transformational experience, including management of energy and infrastructure projects. That was signed by Jose Carrion, the chairman of the Financial Oversight and Management Board. So they recognize the fact that we've got a real problem with the governance of, the public ownership of PREPA. And again, that was Exhibit A based on that $300 million contract, which apparently now has been pulled back with Whitefish. But again, I just want to thank the witnesses, and I'll turn it over to Senator Carper for any opening statements you want to make.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for bringing us together, Mr. Chairman. I know a couple of weeks ago, Senator McCaskill had called for a bipartisan investigation, scheduling a series of hearings. I'm delighted to hear that this is not the last, but the first of several. I want to express as well our thanks and appreciation to those at the table before us, those who work with you, for the extraordinary work they're doing. I believe that in the last 100 years or so, we've had a total of 33 Category 5 hurricanes that have struck the United States. 33 in 100 years. And we had literally 2 within weeks of each other this year. Our friends at GAO present to us each year, as you'll recall, a high-risk list of every other year, beginning of each Congress, of things that we need to focus on, ways that if we did, we could save some money. They always, for years, have now been saying one of our high risks is the incidence of extreme weather and the cost that it's imposing on the federal budget. And the cost here is just extraordinary. And I think in terms of root causes, we need to keep that in mind. I'm delighted to hear the chairman mention the electric grid in Puerto Rico. I oftentimes quote Albert Einstein, who said famously, "In adversity lies opportunity." And as bad as the adversity here is, there's also opportunity, especially with respect to the electric grid. Most of the people, as I understand, I've been to Puerto Rico a number of times as a naval flight officer operating out of Roosevelt Roads, as a governor hosted by Pedro Rosell when he was governor, a part of the National Governors Association, just as a family vacation, and it's been around the island a fair amount. And my recollection is that most of the power is generated in the south of the island. Most of the people live in the north of the island. Most of the power is generated from diesel power generators and utilities. And it is dirty, it is expensive. The cost for electricity in Puerto Rico, I'm told, is roughly twice what we pay here in the mainland. And they have an opportunity. I talked with Governor Rosell yesterday, who I remember he was basically a teenager. His dad and I were contemporaries together in the National Governors Association. But we talked about his vision, and his vision would be to move power generation from the south to north to where the people are, so you don't have to transmit all that electricity from one side of the island to the other, and to not only to use natural gas, bring down the cost. And right now, the diesel fuel comes from, I think, mostly from South America, including Venezuela. And we're not sure that that's a good place to be dependent on. And the idea of having the ability for large ships to come in with natural gas to the north, to have power generation there, and to also, the governor said to me his goal in time is to step up, increase their dependence on their generation of electricity from renewables, including solar and wind and others, maybe including distributed generation of electricity, and things like use fuel cell powered generators for electricity to especially to help like at hospitals and places like that. I'm going to mention, go back to my prepared comments here, if I could. I'm proud of our Delaware National Guard. We've had Delaware National Guard units deployed to Texas, to Florida, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and we're grateful to the men and women, not just of the Delaware National Guard, but National Guards all over this part of the country that are part of this team effort. Mr. Chairman, I hope that in the very near future we could actually have the governors of Texas, maybe the governors of Florida, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands before, so that we can hear their perspectives on what worked well, what didn't, how we can be more helpful, and maybe even include some like mayors. And sometimes we don't want to always hear from people who are going to be critical, but we need to hear folks that are critical as well as people who think that a good job has been done. I always like to say, if it isn't perfect, make it better. And that's, I think, if we could hear from governors, and I'm sure you have this in mind, governors and some other leaders, that'd be helpful. I think we're at the beginning of a very long and difficult rebuilding effort. The cost of the devastation wrought by these hurricanes may well exceed $300 billion. $300 billion, more than double the total economic damage of both Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. We must ensure that the federal government is meeting the needs of the survivors of these disasters, and at the same time, ensure that federal funds, as the chairman has said, are being used efficiently and effectively. Every dollar wasted is a dollar that won't be available to help other Americans who are still in need. We've already started to hear of allegations of programmatic mismanagement and questionable contracts, and many of us, I'm going to talk about this anyway. It's been discussed quite a bit, and I don't think it can be discussed too much. A lot of us were shocked to learn of the $300 million contract to repair the electric grid that was awarded by the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, to Whitefish Energy. And as you know, a company with 2 full-time employees that existed for only 2 years ends up getting a $300 million contract. Heaven help us. Heaven help us. That's just unbelievable. Cannot overstate the urgent need for action to quickly restore power, to repair homes, other structures, as well as to ensure the availability of safe and clean drinking water for all citizens of the United States. I talked about electric generation. I won't go into that further. Looking forward to going down, I think Senator Murkowski is going to lead a delegation maybe as early as this weekend. I hope that's going to come together, and I would love to be a part of that with her. They have a fair amount of jurisdiction over this, as does this committee, as does Environment and Public Works, where I serve as well. I think finally just say I understand I think the time under which people can actually apply for, I think, for individual assistance has been extended maybe to March. Is that, can somebody nod their head on that if that's correct? I think I heard something. Okay, yeah, if you address that when you speak, that would be great. And Yep, it says right here, FEMA last night extended the deadline to March. We're happy to hear of that. And Mr. Chairman, in closing, I just want to say a few words about the obligation that our federal government has to help rebuild when disasters strike our country, any part of our country. When extreme weather like this hits, it's scary, it's dangerous. It's often far more powerful than we imagined it would be. For those of us who haven't had the misfortune of living in the path of the worst destruction, it's hard to imagine. I've ridden out hurricanes in a Navy destroyer off the coast, the Atlantic coast. I've flown into monsoons in my Navy P-3 airplanes out in the Pacific Ocean. Got run over by Katrina with a bunch of Boy Scouts on a sailboat coming down the coast of Florida during that storm. So had a little bit of taste of this stuff. It is scary as can be. But for the people whose reality has become a nightmare, they just want to know that there's a path to a better and a safer future. Clearing that path is a shared responsibility, though. The residents of Puerto Rico, their leaders, their governors, and others must do their part, but our federal government has a moral obligation to help as well. Like the folks at Home Depot like to say, you can do it, we can help. And that, I think, applies here, too. And keeping with the spirit of the Golden Rule, let's continue to make sure that we just do that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Senator Carper. And I'd like my full opening statement, my written statement, enter the record.
And if I could make a similar request, please. Thank you.
Without objection. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you all rise and raise your right hand. You swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Please be seated. Our first witness is Mr. Brock Long. Mr. Long is the administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In his role, he leads FEMA's workforce to fulfill its mission in responding to national disasters and emergencies facing the United States, including the recent hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And Mr. Long, I don't know how long you were on the job before Harvey hit, but again, I just want to thank you for your what I think is just extraordinary service over the last 2.5 months.
Thank you, sir. Before I get started, I'd like to say that my thoughts and prayers are with Ranking Member McCaskill and her husband, Chairman Johnson, Senator Carper, as well as the distinguished members of this committee. It's a pleasure to be here today. It truly has been unprecedented, and I'm here to discuss anything you'd like to regarding the response and recovery efforts that my staff has helped to coordinate across the federal partnership when it comes to all the agencies that have been involved. Like me, what I've seen inside my agency is that I work every day with with people who are truly dedicated, that truly come to work every day, that want to save lives and help people, get on the pathway to recovery as well as become more resilient. I've been in office 132 days. For 70 of those days, we've been actively responding to Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the extraordinary California wildfires as well. Each one of these events that I just spoke of could truly be catastrophic events, standalone events, but they happen in rapid succession of 25-day period, which is obviously unprecedented. Chairman Johnson, in regards to this, I think it's important to point out that before Harvey hit, FEMA was responding to over 30 different disasters across the nation in many states that you folks represent. And not only in addition to those major disaster declarations, we were also responding to over 50 different fire management assistance grants due to the wildfires that are taking place. Now, while there's many improvements to be made to ensure a whole community response and that the National Incident Management System continues to grow in a positive way, I do recognize that there are many challenges ahead, particularly when it comes to California, Texas, Florida, as well as the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. I want to put a couple things into context about the magnitude of this most recent response. If you start with Harvey all the way over to the California wildfires, over 25 million Americans have been impacted. That's 12% of the population in basically a 2-month period or 50-day, over 50-day time period. The FEMA search and rescue teams alone saved over 9,000 lives. That's in addition to our DoD partners, Coast Guard partners, state and local partners, first responders, neighbors helping neighbors like the Cajun Navy coming from Louisiana over to Houston. Tens of thousands of lives have been saved. Over 4.5 million Americans have been registered inside FEMA's individual assistance program. Put that number in context, that's greater than Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Wilma, Hurricane Rita combined. It's the fastest we've ever put people into our systems, and we put over $2.5 billion in the hands of citizens across the country to start that road to recovery. We can't make you whole, but we can actually serve as a catalyst to help you recover. Over $3.5 billion was expedited in our National Flood Insurance Program immediately to our policyholders. That number is projected to grow to $16 or $17 billion just for Hurricanes Harvey and Irma alone. Since the onset of Hurricane Harvey on August 25, the nation has worked together with our mass care partners, Red Cross, state and local partners, to shelter over 1.1 million Americans in congregate shelters. The peak population in one night was 200,000. That's unprecedented. We don't have numbers like that ever before. I also have reason to believe that the commodity mission and the humanitarian mission to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, as well as all of the states, has been one of the largest humanitarian missions in the history of FEMA. Now, while there's existing response and recovery challenges that need to be solved, I think it's, Chairman Johnson, in regards to your opening comments, it's important to point out that an optimal response and recovery process should be federally supported, state managed, and locally executed, okay? Each level of government has a very critical role to play that we have to continue to define what the responsibilities are and what the target capabilities should be. In the case of Puerto Rico, they were hit by 2 major hurricanes in rapid succession, which created a diminished capacity. Not only were their responders now disaster survivors, but also the ability to respond was also compromised. That puts FEMA as the primary responder and pretty much the first responder, which is never a good situation. When FEMA is the first and primary responder and the only responder for many weeks, we're never going to move as fast as anybody would like, and I recognize that. Moving forward, we continue to work every day to restore the power, particularly in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands. Restoring the power solves a multitude of problems, and it's going to require our partners at the Army Corps working hand in glove with Governor Rosselló, who I talk to on a very regular basis. We have to restore the hospitals and medical functions to pre-disaster conditions and consider how to make them more resilient in the future. Each one of the disaster housing missions is going to be unique from California all the way to the Virgin Islands, and we're working to rectify those issues every day. Clearing roads, fixing roads, getting rid of debris is also a major mission. There's 3.5 cubic yards of debris on Puerto Rico alone, okay? Communications and cell service, is something else. I believe we're up to about 85%, for example, on Puerto Rico. Retail industry's back up to about 90%. The water systems are back up to about 80% that PRASA organizes. So progress is being made, but we have a long way to go. In the future, I haven't had a chance to catch my breath, do an exhaustive, after-action review of all the things that just happened and what we've learned or where we should go, but I do have several ideas. I think as a community, we have to streamline disaster recovery programs that are offered from across the federal government. We've got to simplify them, streamline them, make them easy to understand, and help our state and local partners understand when to use these things. I'll be asking for your help to do that. Implement and ensure survivable communications. We have to work with the private industry to make sure that as we become more and more attached to our cell phones, that the systems that are being implemented are resilient and redundant. We have to do more pre-disaster mitigation. Pre-disaster mitigation is the key to becoming more resilient and reducing disaster impacts. We have to ensure state and local governments like Texas and Florida are the examples, have their own life sustainment commodity capabilities and that the federal government is not shouldering the entire burden. We have to find low to no cost ways to prepare our citizens and help our citizens be properly insured. Insurance is the first line of defense, and those who are insured will recover quicker than those that don't have insurance. We have to ensure that states and baseline level capabilities, that states have their own baseline capabilities to handle individual assistance and public assistance when federal disaster declarations are not coming to town. And we also have to do a lot of work to fix the NFIP program. These are just some of the things that we have to work on, and a multitude of several more ideas that I have. I'm honored to be here and answer your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Long. Our next witness is Robert Salesses. Mr. Salesses is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense Integration and Defense Support of Civil Authorities. In this role, he is responsible for the development of policy for defense support, civil authorities, and Homeland Security interagency coordination. Mr. Salesses.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Senator Carper, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Department of Defense's support of the federal response to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. The Department of Defense is a fully committed and critical partner in the national response system. DoD has a long tradition of working with our federal, state, and local partners in responding to domestic disasters and emergencies. Led by Administrator Long and FEMA, DoD plays a key role in the federal government's support to state and local disasters. We also support other federal partners and departments, such as Health and Human Services, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, in their role as emergency support function leads. DoD is well prepared and has forces and capabilities ready to act immediately to sustain lives in the aftermath of disasters. DoD ensures a high level of preparedness by continually enhancing our integrated planning, improving our training, and conducting joint exercises between our federal, state, and local partners. In advance of each of these hurricanes, Secretary of Defense directed DoD to provide full support to life-saving, life-sustaining operations in coordination with our federal partners. Based on this direction, DoD postures significant capabilities: Navy ships, strategic airlift, helicopters, medical teams, and logistics prior to each of the hurricanes' landfall to assist the citizens of Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. To date, the Department of Defense has responded to over 311 mission assignments from FEMA and our other federal partners. Using the total force in its response, thousands of Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine, active and reserve and Guard, have responded to these hurricanes. Under the command of General Robinson, federal forces conducted search and rescue, evacuation operations, provided damage assessments, surveyed and made repairs to open airports and seaports, cleared critical roadways, transported life-sustaining commodities of food and water, provided fuel distribution, conducted assessments of civilian hospitals, and provided medical support to include evacuating patients back to the continental United States. Additionally, U.S. Transcom has flown over 2,800 flights over the last 60 days in support of these hurricane operations, with over 1,900 flights in support of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, transporting urgent first responders like FEMA's urban search and rescue teams, HHS's disaster medical teams, relief supplies and equipment, and evacuating hundreds of residents and patients. The Defense Logistics Agency has provided millions of gallons of fuel, over 850 generators, more than 100 million meals, and millions of liters of water and life-sustaining commodities. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers conducted flood mitigation operations in Houston and Puerto Rico, conducted maritime port surveys and openings along with the U.S. Coast Guard, installed temporary roofs to enable people to stay in their homes, provided temporary emergency power to over 550 critical facilities. These included hospitals, fire stations, police stations, and other municipal buildings. And more significantly, continues to work to restore Puerto Rico's electric grid and its pre-storm status, a new and unique mission for the Corps of Engineers, and it's under the role of the Stafford Act. Our military services at the installation level also provided critical transportation, logistics, medical services to local officials and their communities under immediate response authority. And thousands of Army and Air National Guard personnel working with their respective governors from the affected states and the supporting states conducted search and rescue, evacuation operations, commodities distribution, and other critical support operations. The men and women of the Defense Department, military and civilian, were ready and acted with a great sense of urgency in responding to Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Chairman Johnson, Senator Carper, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Salesses. Our next witness is Major General Donald Jackson, General Jackson is the Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. General Jackson oversees the work of the Army Corps in responding to major disasters, such as the major hurricanes that recently hit the United States. General Jackson.
Chairman Johnson, Senator Carper, distinguished members of the committee, my name is Major General Ed Jackson, Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Corps conducts emergency response activities under two basic authorities, the Stafford Act and Public Law 8499. Under the Stafford Act, we support FEMA under the National Response Framework as the lead federal agency for Emergency Support Function 3, Public Works and Engineering. ESF-3 provides temporary emergency power, temporary roofing, debris management, infrastructure assessment, critical public facility restoration, and temporary housing. Under Public Law 8499, we prepare for disasters through planning, coordination, and training with local, state, and federal partners. We assist state and local entities to implement advanced measures that prevent or reduce storm event damages, and we repair damage to authorized federal projects and work with states and municipalities to rehabilitate and restore eligible non-federal flood infrastructure to pre-storm condition. When disasters occur, Corps teams and other resources are mobilized from across the command to assist local offices with their response to the event. As part of this mission, the Corps has more than 50 specially trained teams supported by emergency contracts that perform a wide range of public works and engineering-related support functions that I just described. The Corps uses pre-awarded contracts that can be quickly activated for missions such as debris removal, temporary roofing, and generator installation. This year, the Corps supported FEMA-led federal response and recovery operations in support of multiple events, including Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. FEMA directed 37 mission assignments to the Corps to assist in Hurricane Harvey response and recovery. Currently, the Corps has 183 employees still deployed. The Corps assisted in temporary emergency power and continues to support the state of Texas with the development and implementation of a temporary housing project management plan. Debris teams led by Corps subject matter experts continue providing state and local municipalities with debris technical assistance to define requirements and monitor debris removal and disposal operations in 15 counties. FEMA directed 81 mission assignments to the Corps to assist in Hurricanes Irma and Maria response and recovery. Currently, the Corps has over 1,500 personnel deployed. As of this morning, the Corps has completed about 1,000 assessments and 550 temporary generator installations across the Caribbean. This includes about 250 assessments and 150 generator installations in the U.S. Virgin Islands and 750 assessments and 400 generator installations in Puerto Rico. Under FEMA authority, we are also assisting Puerto Rico with operation and maintenance of critical non-federal generators across the island. The Corps has completed over 13,000 temporary roofing installations in Florida and is on track to complete the mission by the 3rd of November. We also have completed over 6,000 temporary roofing installations across the Caribbean, including over 2,000 in the U.S. Virgin Islands and 4,000 in Puerto Rico. Roofing requirements in both the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico have been extensive, requiring additional material and construction support, which initially slowed progress. We have adjusted, added capacity, and are now seeing daily improvements in both locations. Corps debris subject matter experts provided technical assistance to counties across Florida and Georgia in response to Hurricane Irma and continue to provide oversight to 5 regions within the Florida Department of Emergency Management. The Corps is working to remove an estimated 1 million cubic yards of debris from the U.S. Virgin Islands and 6 million cubic yards of debris in Puerto Rico. The Corps worked closely with the U.S. Coast Guard, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and local authorities to open harbors and navigation channels across all affected areas, critical to restoring commerce and allowing the flow of commodities and essential equipment to reach affected communities. The Corps worked closely with officials in Texas and Florida to manage local flood control reservoirs during periods of unprecedented rainfall. In Puerto Rico, Corps dam and levee teams inspected 17 priority dams and worked closely with the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority to stabilize a spillway failure at Guajataca Dam. Additionally, the Corps teams cleared existing outflow conduits and placed emergency pumps to further reduce water levels in the dam, yet restore flow to a critical treatment plant that supports the needs of over 30,000 people. On September 30th, the Corps was given a FEMA mission assignment under Stafford Act authority to assist the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority in conducting emergency repairs to the power grid itself. The Corps is partnering with PREPA in this effort and has established a general officer, senior executive-led task force, as well as 3 area offices on the island to oversee work and provide technical assistance. The Department of Energy has embedded experts in our team and continues to assist in our efforts. Within 2 weeks of receiving the mission assignment, the Corps awarded contracts for large-scale temporary power generation to stabilize the grid in San Juan and for additional line repair assets that will assist ongoing efforts by PREPA to complete the mission as quickly as possible. The Corps remains fully committed and capable of executing its other civil works activities across the nation despite our heavy involvement in these ongoing response and recovery operations. We also remain ready and poised to assist any future events as they may occur. This concludes my testimony, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, General Jackson. Our final witness is Dr. Robert Kadlec. Dr. Kadlec is the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Kadlec coordinates the department's medical assistance after a major disaster, including sending teams of medical professionals to affected areas and working with local hospitals. Dr. Kadlec.
Thank you very much, Chairman Johnson, Senator Carper, and members of the committee. It is a privilege to appear before you to discuss our nation's medical and public health response. As Director Long identified, an unprecedented series of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes that hit the U.S. mainland and its territories this season. HHS, as well as our interagency partners, FEMA, DHS, VA, and DoD, have pushed many organizational and historical boundaries to save lives and support the communities and people impacted by these storms. I fully recognize there are regions in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands where people are still facing dire conditions. I saw the devastation firsthand and can assure you that HHS continues our response at 110% effort and will continue to work as hard as we can until the conditions improve and we can bring people back to recovery. Since this is my first time testifying before this committee, I'll just begin with a brief description of this position called ASPR. Sir, in response to your comments, Mr. Chairman, about Katrina, the ASPR was created almost 11 years ago in response to Hurricane Katrina by the Pandemic and All Hazard Preparedness Act. Its objective was simple: to create unity of command by consolidating all of HHS public health and medical preparedness and response functions under one person. I had the privilege of being the staff director of the Senate subcommittee that drafted this legislation. ASPR's mission is to save lives and protect America from health security threats. On behalf of HHS, ASPR leads public health and medical response to disasters and emergencies in accordance with National Response Framework and Emergency Support Function Number 8, which includes all our federal partners that are here seated at this dais. Today, the threats facing our country are increasingly diverse and more lethal. My main objective is to improve national readiness and response capabilities for the 21st century threats, and I'm doing that through 4 key priority efforts: strong leadership, creating a national disaster healthcare system, as Director Long identified, that is more resilient and capable to the challenges that we face in the future; sustain a robust and reliable public health security capabilities that, again, reside at the state and local level and, again, are the backbone of any response to any future disaster circumstance; and then lastly, advance an innovative medical countermeasure enterprise. During Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Nate, their severity and near simultaneity created unique challenges, especially in Puerto Rico, where no place, no person, no life was untouched. During my trip there, I was overwhelmed by the resilience of our fellow citizens who are making do in extraordinarily difficult situations that continue to improve over time because of the extraordinary efforts of the people and the agencies that are represented here today. Our response strategy for health emergencies have been threefold. First, save lives, principally through the deployment of our disaster medical assistance teams. You should be proud to know that I met with your fellow citizens from your states during my trips down to Florida, Texas, and to Puerto Rico, where folks from Oklahoma, from Wisconsin, from Delaware, and from New Hampshire were aiding their fellow citizens firsthand. Second is to stabilize the healthcare system, ensuring with FEMA such very important activities such as uninterrupted fuel supplies, potable water supplies could be delivered to not only to hospitals but to dialysis clinics to ensure that these vital systems stayed in place. And lastly is to restore healthcare services that need to be recovered to pre-disaster levels. In Puerto Rico, frankly, we're still responding. In other areas, recovery is underway. In order to save lives, as I mentioned, ASPR activated the National Disaster Medical System and deployed more than 2,900 medical personnel from 21 states and hundreds of other federal employees, including U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps personnel. For each of these storms, we deployed teams even before the hurricanes made landfall, so they were ready to respond immediately once the storm passed. In total, we've cared for more than 22,000 patients in the affected states and territories, 12,400 in Puerto Rico alone, and sent 950 tons of medical equipment and supplies to these affected areas. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today.
Thank you, Dr. Kadlec. I'd like to start with Administrator Long. Mr. Long, you talked about you're in a real kind of danger zone when FEMA is the in charge of the first responding, when you're no longer subordinate, but you're leading the whole effort. Can you just describe really how it's all supposed to work and why that's a problem?
Sure. So if you look at the Stafford Act is designed to support state and local efforts. And the way disaster declarations work is that when a local government's capacity has been exceeded, they call upon county-to-county mutual aid first or other mutual aid agreements to see if they can mitigate the disaster and the response. If that's not an option, or if that's not working, or the capacity has further been expanded, then they'll call upon the state. The governor will issue a state of emergency, and then the state will try to rectify as much as they can the disaster at hand. And then once that's been exhausted, or the state recognizes that it's beyond their capacity, they call upon the federal government, and we begin to mobilize. In many cases, you've seen the National Incident Management System and the whole community work, and the successful model was in Texas, it was in Florida, and it's now in California. While everything never runs as perfect, for the most part, it's operating as it should. What we have to do in regards to Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and other island territories is to ensure that they have management infrastructure in place at both the state and the local level, and that we can also make sure that we have survivable communications. Anytime we lose communications and completely black out like we did in Puerto Rico, it's hard to obtain situational awareness and fully understand what the true response and recovery needs are.
You've only been on the job for 132 days, but I guess who's keeping track? Huh? Apparently you are. But you've been involved in disaster response for many years. Has there been a shift? I mean, have we created moral hazard? Is there more a growing reliance on the federal government being that first responder and being primarily responsible as opposed to be subordinate?
That's a great question. I believe that would be in pockets. You know, some of the states, they're very capable states, and then there's some states where I believe, for example, maybe we need to take a look at which states actually have rainy day funds and actually have mechanisms to be able to implement their own individual and public assistance programs when federal disaster assistance is not coming. I also believe that many states, or several states, have their own ability to run life-saving commodity capabilities. They have the ability to handle the first 72 to 120 hours where other states have not addressed those issues, or island territories. And so I think we do have to go back and reestablish with our state and local partners what is the baseline effort that should be there, and clearly put forward those capabilities to make sure that we are prepared to backfill. One of the things I want to do is I want to develop state integration teams. I want to move beyond my regional offices that I have and put full-time staff in with the state agencies and island territories to make sure that we're truly doing real integrated planning on a daily basis, that FEMA is a part of the conversation every day, so that we fully understand how to support all governors when called upon directly.
So that might be a pretty good action item here, is when you have time, go back and really do a state-by-state, territory-by-territory assessment in terms of their emergency management system, whether it's funded or whether it's prepared. We'll note that. Finally, as I left Puerto Rico, to me it was just all about power, power, and power. You've got a disaster, you've got a crisis already, but it will grow if we don't establish power. So I'd like to talk to ask the administrator and also the general, where are we at? What are the prospects of reestablishing power? What do we have to do?
So right now I'm exercising under the Stafford Act emergency authorities, which is why we mission assigned the Army Corps of Engineers. It was the right thing to do initially because of the diminished capacity on the island. They're mobilizing under emergency authorities to rebuild the grid to U.S. code standards. The discussion that needs to be taken after that is, how do we build a power grid that is resilient? That's going to require authorities far greater than the Stafford Act affords me at FEMA. You know, typically what we have to do is restore to a pre-disaster condition, but obviously that is not optimal and not the way I would ever recommend this country to go. We do not want to be back in this situation again after having this disaster and an opportunity to change it. So I'll turn it over to General Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I think the grid today is slightly over 33% restored based upon the basic load that it had before the storm. So there's incremental progress that's being made. The line repair and the restoration activities that have been done up to this point have been done by PREPA, and the Corps of Engineers has done a few things in terms of getting personnel on the ground. We installed a 50 megawatt generator at the Palo Seco plant within the last week that helped stabilize the grid in greater San Juan area, and it added about 40 megawatts to the system today and yesterday, which has been very helpful in upping the power. We're approaching this in a number of different ways. First of all, the normal authorities that the Corps of Engineers has under the Stafford Act are ESF3, temporary emergency power, which are generator installations. So what we've done typically is we will come into an affected area, we'll install the generators, and then we will take them out as the power grid comes up. And the power grid restoration activity is usually handled by the local public utility and sometimes augmented by other capabilities outside the state. In this particular case, PREPA chose not to activate the type of normal arrangements that are used by the Public Utility Association, and so FEMA turned to the Corps of Engineers to help PREPA with the grid, the restoration of the grid based upon the emergencies that it created. So what we've done up to this point in order to do that is to continue our ESF3 temporary generator installation mission. We're almost at 400 temporary generator installations at this point today, and those generator sizes range from 40 kilowatt all the way up to 1.5 megawatt, and those get installed at critical facilities that are prioritized by FEMA and by the Commonwealth, and that's typically hospitals, water, wastewater treatment facilities, communications platforms, schools, and other places. And we will continue to do that as the grid continues to come together. We've also worked very closely with PREPA. And again, just to remind everyone, we got this mission assignment on the 30th of September to do the grid restoration in Puerto Rico. So we've been doing emergency temporary power since Irma hit on the 6th of September. So that mission started then, and we've gradually increased our capability to do more, and we'll continue to do so as long as we need to. We awarded a contract to award the 50 megawatt generator to help stabilize the load in San Juan and get more people power more quickly. Since the 30th of September, we've also worked very closely with PREPA to get an understanding of what material they needed to do this grid repair mission. If you can, and that's been a very arduous effort because PREPA didn't have a real good handle or understanding on what they had in their laydown yards, so we had to go physically from place to place to count how many poles they had, how many spools of wire, transformers, and the like, which we've done that. We've placed things on order, and we've worked very hard through multiple venues to get the material moving toward Puerto Rico, and that's happening as we speak today. We also went through the process of awarding contracts. We are unable to enter into the mutual assistance agreements like the public utility could. So a mutual assistance agreement that's entered into by public utility is very similar to what we award for our debris, our temporary emergency power contracts. They're on the shelf, ready to award. They can be awarded right away. For the contracts that we've awarded to prime vendors at Fluor and also Power Secure, we've had to go through a competition process in accordance with the Federal Acquisition Regulation to award contracts, and we've done that. And we've got today 150 contractors on the ground, aside from the 450 Corps of Engineer employees that are dedicated to the power mission on the ground today. By the end of the weekend, those numbers will rise up about another 500, and by the middle of November, we should have about 1,000 people on the ground. So we're moving very fast to mobilize the line crews that we need to continue the effort in support of PREPA, and there are milestones that we've been given by the administration. Initially, we're 30% by the end of October, which we're there now. Thankful in part to a lot of the hard work that PREPA is doing, and our next goal is 50% of pre-storm load by the end of November, and that's the goal that we're shooting for right now.
Okay, thank you, General Jackson. By the way, let's go 7-minute rounds. I know there's requests for 2 rounds, which we can do if people stick around, but also have to be mindful of time. Senator Carper.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony and all you had to offer. My wife, Mr. Long, is a graduate of Appalachian State University. Her dad taught there math and physics for 40 years. As I recall, you went to undergraduate and graduate school at Appalachian State University. She asked me to tell you the Mountaineers are proud of you. And I recall meeting your wife and I think your children at your confirmation hearing. And to your family and to the families of everyone who each of you represent, whether you happen to be in FEMA or part of the Army Corps or the health folks, I just want to really convey our thanks to them for the support they're providing for their loved ones to enable them to help people in dire straits. I want to stay with the issue of energy. I want to stick with energy. Recovering governor, thought a lot about how to provide a nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation, and energy is a big part of that. Affordable energy, reliable, dependable energy is a huge part of that. And they don't have affordable energy in Puerto Rico. They didn't have it before, and obviously they don't have reliable or dependable energy today. And I said earlier that in adversity lies opportunity, and my conversation with the governor yesterday in Puerto Rico, where we talked about this situation they have now with power generated in the south of the island. Most of the people live in the north. They use mostly diesel to power. They provide power for the electric grid. Electric grid's badly damaged, and they still have this reliance on oil, a lot of which comes from South America. A great when I look around the world, one of the I think smart energy programs involves natural gas where it's cheap, and to supplement that with renewables. And when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you bring up the natural gas and provide the electricity in a cost-effective, cleaner way than we would get from diesel or other fossil fuels. Let me just ask, and I said earlier, the governor said to me yesterday, eventually wants them to increase their dependence on renewable forms of energy to as much as 30%. That's his goal. And let me say, I embrace his goal. I embrace his goal. How do we make this happen, and how can we help make this happen?
I'll take a shot at that first. Again, my authorities are limited to the Stafford Act. And one of the issues that we're coming into is, and one of the issues that the Army Corps is facing is that we recognize that the age of the infrastructure on Puerto Rico, I believe the power plants was close to over 40 years average age. Worldwide, the average age of power plants is about 18 years. So there's a big discrepancy there. And in many cases, I think what we're running into in the complexities is some deferred maintenance issues and different things. And so if you put all of that aside, what I have the authority to do under emergency essential services is basically to get the power back up and running to prevent further loss of life and public health events from occurring. In regards to building innovative, more energy efficient,
and I might add more resilient.
Right, resilient. Definitely more resilient. I think we all agree that that's probably what's needed. But the authority for me to spend taxpaying dollars to do that, I'm not so sure that I have, and that's something that I would ask, this committee to take a look at.
General.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Just a couple things. Everything that you said was right about the preponderance of the power generation being.
Note this: I rarely say everything right. That's a special day.
Most of the power generation is on the southern part of the island, and most of the population densities are on the north. So those north-south transmission lines are critical. About half the power plants that are on Puerto Rico are fossil fuel. The other half are a combination of wind and solar. Department of Energy has taken a hard look at that. Just for what they have on the island right now are supposed to produce about 5,200 megawatts of power. They really only use about half that. So there's a lot of room for some, addressing maybe less power plants, more efficient, that produce the right amount of power with the right type of fuel to service the requirement that exists on the island today. And the Department of Energy has been thinking about that, and they've been looking at that. And they've been working very closely, I think, with PREPA to help understand, where some of their challenges are, to make recommendations to the administration and to Congress on things like how much load do they really need, and how much redundancy do they need in the system, and how do they build additional capabilities to balance that load across all the demands in the system. How do they modernize the system to include the hardening of the system to improve resilience? These are things that the Department of Energy has ideas on that they've shared with me that I know that they are working up as part of I think it's a FEMA report that we have some recommendations on maybe the long-term what a long-term solution might be for power and other things. So DOE is really looking at that hard. They got some real smart guys that are there on the ground with us, going through the work that we're doing to help guide us and make sure that we're doing the right things. But ultimately, they're also looking at what's the right way ahead for the future of Puerto Rico so they can make those informed recommendations to the leadership.
Yeah, you mentioned DOE has some really smart guys on the ground there, or we'd like, my staff and I'd like to be able to reach out to them and to talk with them. And for the record, we're going to ask you to provide those ASAP, the contact information for those
Yes, sir,
folks.
I will.
That'd be great. Thank you. And usually it takes weeks, if not months, for a full assessment of damages to be made and an estimate of the total cost to rebuild. And let me just ask I guess for everybody, how far along are you in the process for Texas, for Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands? When do you expect those complete assessments of needs to be ready? We're expecting a third supplemental appropriations bill, but will the administration be making additional emergency supplemental requests to assist those communities as further assessments are completed?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Senate and the House for responding very quickly to every request for emergency supplementals. I know that my guys have been working around the clock to make sure that you guys stay informed of when we believe that we're bumping up and running out of the disaster relief fund. So I truly do appreciate it. We've asked for 3 supplementals, if I remember correctly, this year alone. In regards to where the Virgin Islands all the way to California, each one of these states or island territories is in different stages of the recovery, but each one of these is going to be a tremendous long recovery. It's going to be a long haul for each one. For example, Texas and Florida are obviously still focused on recovery housing and making sure that we provide, people with a proper place to stay as the rebuilding begins, as well as debris removal. California is in the same boat as well, but there's still some sensitivities in the state of California as when it comes to hazardous materials and then associated with the debris, but also with with rainfall, when you've burned off the vegetation, making sure that we mitigate against watershed issues that come into play as well. So everybody's in different stages, but the long-term recovery is going to be long. I don't think we have a good handle on the total cost of this, but you can rest assured that my guys will be in touch, with your staff members to make sure that we don't fumble the ball when it comes to disaster recovery, and we will do our best to also take care of tax-paying dollars every day.
Thank you. If I could ask the other witnesses to briefly respond to the same question, please. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Senator, we're continuing. As far as, I'll only comment on the power grid for Puerto Rico. So we're still assessing the damages. We got initial reports from PREPA when we first were given the mission assignment, and we found that the damages weren't necessarily as great as they had originally reported. But what we have to do is put people on lines and make sure that, just because the line's not laying on the ground doesn't mean it's operable. So we're in the process of doing that now, and we'll probably be doing that as we do the repairs for the next several weeks. And we will be able to put together, I think, a much better assessment of what the overall cost to repair the grid to the standard that we're seeking under the Stafford Act in very short order.
Okay. I'm going to ask questions for the record. I'm going to re-ask the same question and ask you and your staff to respond to that question. All right. Thanks very much.
Okay. Again, really appreciate the number of members here. I bumped the questioning up to 7 minutes, and I want members and witnesses to stay within that 7 minutes as close as possible, just out of respect of everybody. Senator Tester.
Will do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'll just tell you I appreciate this document. Appreciate it a lot. I think that this is an instructive piece of information, and it's instructive because what it tells me is that we are going to continue down this road until we start looking at root causes. And I know we never ever want to accept the fact, because it is a bit uncomfortable, of what we do with a changing climate, but when we have towns evacuated in Montana in the middle of October due to wildfire, we got some major things that Mother Nature's telling us, and if we don't address it, we're really not doing our fiscal fiduciary responsibility. First of all, I want to start out by saying, Brock Long, I think you're doing a great job. You came in under difficult circumstances and getting pounded and pounded and pounded, and I think that you've really put your shoulder to the wheel and worked as hard as you could in a very difficult situation. So I want to express my appreciation. A couple things in your testimony. You talked about 3.5 cubic yards, or was that million cubic yards of debris on Puerto Rico?
5 million, but it may be off.
3.5 million?
It's 6
cubic is
million.
what we're tracking.
So, and that may be an older number, so the numbers are changing.
Okay.
Yeah.
You also talked about pre-disaster mitigation in your opening remarks, and I think the savings is for every $1 in pre-disaster mitigation. It saves $4 on disaster and on the backside. I don't think we're spending enough on mitigation, and I think your testimony implied that. Do you have any ideas on what we need to do to address this issue?
Absolutely. You know, the problem with the way the system is established is you have to get hit to have an extraordinary amount of post-disaster hurricane mitigation program grant funding. I believe that's not the right way of doing business. I believe specifically Section 404 in the Robert T. Stafford Act that dictates how money is formulated or provided for mitigation purposes. The 404 money, it would be amazing if we could work with the Senate and this committee to move that to the front side, to offer up, on average, I believe we put out $700 or $800 million in post-disaster mitigation funding. Why are we not doing that on the front side and get it out of recovery, reduce the complexities of recovery, and put it up front? And I don't know what the right mix is. I don't know what the right amount of money to make a real dent in it is, but it's got to be not only money up front, but I do believe that, you know, the key to resiliency is held at the local level of government with elected officials, smart land use planning, building codes, different things, you know, making sure that there are redundant systems that are in place. And, you know, so it's going to have to be a whole community effort on the pre-disaster side. But if we could move that 404 funding to the front side of disasters, and it will not be an easy move, I think it makes perfect sense, and I think we can all agree that that's what needs to be done.
Okay, well, that's good. If you have any language that you could forward to this committee and the subcommittee on Homeland Security on approps, I would certainly appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Because I think that it's a no-brainer. Major General Jackson, you said you were assessing the grid in Puerto Rico. Can you give me, are you about done with that assessment? I guess what I'll ask the question, you just tell me if you can answer it or not. Is it shot? Is it 90% shot, 95%, 100%, or what? Where's it at? I mean, I'm talking about done. Start over, rebuild.
No, the answer to that is no, it's not shot. The initial reports that we got said there was 100% of damage to distribution. That's 31,000 miles worth of line.
Yeah.
That's not the case. The initial reports that I received said that all of that 80% of the transmission lines were shot. That's 2,400 miles of high voltage.
What do you think it is now? I mean, what do you think it is?
Sir, I think, I mean, literally, I mean, part of it is just, let me start by just saying, we've got to, as I flew over Puerto Rico a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
There's a lot of lines that are up visibly. There are a lot of lines that are down visibly. The problem is until you get folks on the ground to see if those lines and the components that make up the line system are operable, you don't really know if the line's energized. So that's what we're doing right now. We're not doing a full assessment and waiting to do repairs. We already sort of know where we need to go and what we need to focus on.
So what I'm trying to get here is this. We've been told that the distribution system in Puerto Rico was horrible before the storms hit. Are we doing repairs to a horrible distribution system, or are we fixing a horrible distribution system?
Sir, under the Stafford Act, we are fixing the system to get power out to the people as fast as
So
we
that the next hurricane hits, it's not going to knock down everything that wasn't knocked down in this hurricane. We're back in the same boat.
If you have a Category 5 hurricane, unless the lines are buried under the ground, it's going to knock wires down.
Even if it's new construction.
Even if it's new construction.
All right. Is there any effort to talk about maybe developing generation so that the distribution isn't as needed? I'm talking not only renewable, but even conventional generation.
Senator, my understanding is, as Senator Carper alluded, the governor has an interest in locating the power generation more closely to the population densities that they support.
Okay.
Therefore, it would obviate the needs for these long
Good.
transmission lines across the island. And DOE has taken a look at that
Yeah.
to help put together some ideas for the leadership.
Are you taking, and I don't know if you do this or if Mr. Salises does this, but are you looking at every option, not only carbon-based, but also solar and wind and geothermal?
Senator, my understanding is DOE is looking at what the most efficient, modern, appropriate system would be for Puerto Rico to make those type recommendations.
Do you guys know anything about PREPA? Nobody?
Senator, what I know something.
Well,
about
here's
PREPA,
what I want to know about. It's a 9-member board that I should be tickled pink that they gave a contract to a company in Montana. But as you look at the situation, 2 people, been in business 2 years, never done disaster work before. What kind of people are on this board? No bid contract. I mean, I got to tell you something. If it was any of you guys, if it was you, Brock, I wouldn't have started out saying you're doing a great job. I'll tell you that, okay? Right. So I don't understand what's going on here, and I don't understand what the accountability is. We have a federal financial oversight board. Maybe they're not doing their job, but somebody's not doing their job. Would you agree? I see some head nods and... Thank you very much.
There's a governance issue. There's no doubt about it. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for the work you're doing in these disasters. Unfortunately, and given what's happening with the climate, we may be seeing a lot more of these disasters, bigger, stronger, and increased frequency. So it's important that we take lessons learned from what we've seen here and understand that we're probably going to have to be applying them again and again going forward. Mr. Long, my time is short today, but I wanted to just alert you that I sent a letter to you yesterday in my capacity as a ranking member on the Federal Management Oversight Subcommittee of this committee. And in that letter, I've asked a series of detailed questions about FEMA's response to Hurricane Maria and the humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. I'm not going to go into all of those details, but the letter is going to you. I hope to have your commitment to get a quick response, because I'm sure our subcommittee will have further hearings on this matter, and it'll be helpful to frame that discussion. Mr. Chairman, if I could just have that letter entered into the record.
Without objection.
Absolutely, I'm aware, and we will respond very quickly.
I appreciate that, Mr. Long. Thank you. And as many of my colleagues have mentioned, the concern about, particularly in Puerto Rico, is to make sure that we have sustainability built into any kind of the response. And I know the Stafford Act prevents that from happening in the fact that it talks about limiting rebuilding to the way it was in place when the disaster occurred. You alluded to that as well in your comments. Do you think it's time for us to take a look at the Stafford Act? Would you recommend us taking a good look at whether or not that makes sense, given the situation we're in now and what will likely be future situations given climate change?
Yeah, and I work with my staff every day, and there are definite changes to the Stafford Act that we could consider, but I would also like to take the time to methodically, go through those and submit those if there are recommendations, not only from my staff at FEMA, but the emergency management community as a whole. I'm always for reviewing and bettering processes. There are opportunities for mitigation as a result of going through this, but rebuilding a grid to the level that we're all discussing here is not within my authority. And I'm concerned about the deferred maintenance issues already when it comes to restoring and conducting permanent work as it is.
Well, I appreciate working with you on that. And as we've talked about before, personally, some of those disasters that may not be on the Stafford Act, some of which is a disaster we had in Michigan and Flint, for example. I think there are a lot of lessons learned from that disaster as well that means that we need to take a hard look at the Stafford Act and try to make improvements to make sure the American people get the help that they need when disaster strikes their community. And that leads to my next question, which relates to the long-term nature of these disasters. And especially from my experience in Flint, is that aid is normally available when the TV cameras are running. Usually there's quite a bit of aid that will flow once the public media attention is there. The challenge is when the cameras stop covering the event, and these folks have to deal with these disasters for many years in the future. So my question is, how long do you expect FEMA to be working in the areas affected by these hurricanes? And do you have the capacity to handle that workload, which is probably going to be over the next decade or more?
At this point, no doubt about it. When it comes to recovery staff, we're stressed. You know, we're having to rob Peter to pay Paul, as you could say, from other disasters. I think right now we have roughly 26 open disasters that we're working nationwide that don't get media coverage. And so in some cases, what we're trying to do is go to more virtual models, and hopefully states are calling upon state-to-state mutual aid to be able to start managing a lot of their disasters and doing things more virtually. But in regards to the most recent, these 4 events that we're talking about, from the California wildfires to the 3 major events, it's going to take many years to go through. In some cases, when it goes back to your question on the Stafford Act, we do have Section 428 of the Stafford Act that allows us to do move in a more expedited manner and possibly in a more resilient manner, but we have to make some decisions as to whether or not the program is working. It does reduce the sheer number of project worksheets that we have to generate and allows us to do work more efficiently, and I would like to continue going down that path, but also take a comprehensive look at how do we get locals and state government to also make sure that they're funding for staff positions adequately as well. When it comes to future grants, I would rather have grants to hire and train proper staffing than to buy equipment. And there may be people that disagree with me in the industry, but you can't replace human beings, and that's what we need when it comes to the large amount of disasters that we're facing.
And with these large disasters, I know it's still early to get a sense of what the cost will be, which will be very large. And I think all of you have referred to the fact that's an ongoing process right now. But do you have any indication in terms of the hurricanes? How do you think the cost will stack up? Which will be the most expensive? How would you rank them?
Well, it's interesting. You know, when you look at Harvey and Irma, I think there's 2.5 million people in Florida alone that have been entered into individual assistance. Okay, 2.5 million. In Harvey, we're still under 1 million. Okay. But then when you look at the impacts to housing, the amount of money it would cost to fix flood-based housing issues is going to be tremendously more expensive than I believe what we may see in Florida. California is a whole nother, as long as I've been doing this, I've never seen a more disturbing disaster in my life. And I think they lost 6,800 homes in that. And so each one's tremendously different, and the cost will vary based on what the services are that are needed. As far as overall cost, I've heard numbers inside from my finance guys saying that we're probably spending about $200 million a day right now just responding to the 4 disasters that we're facing.
Yeah. And how would you but rank them? What would in terms of hurricanes, what's going to be the most expensive for us, and the second most? I've heard estimates that Texas will be number 1. Is that accurate? Yeah.
Probably Texas. Well, I don't know. I take that back because we're not done with Puerto Rico. We're still trying to uncover. That. But I would believe that right now Texas is probably the most expensive one. But here again, that's just a pure guess, and we still have numbers coming in.
And obviously, with long-term funding, we have to have local government, state government engaged. But they need to make plans for long-term investments to recover and to make sure that they're sustainable. But it's difficult for them to do that without knowing the amount of money that's available, right. Isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here again, the money comes mostly, the largest majority of the funding that states interact with FEMA is definitely on the recovery end. And that goes back to the pre-disaster mitigation point. How do you plan to implement mitigation strategies when you have to get hit and you're not sure how much money you're going to come into based on the type of disaster? That's why I think that we have to pre-plan, take it out of recovery and put it up front so that you can do better visionary planning over the next couple of years to truly mitigate your communities.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing on hurricanes. And I appreciate the administrator speaking of California. This hearing is not about wildfires, but I would like to urge that we do everything we can to, as you appreciate, recognize we lost 42 lives in California, and the estimate is currently that we lost 8,900 homes and structures. On that point, from FEMA, there is still a need. You're doing a great job. The Army Corps of Engineers, I was there. I visited the site. I've met with the families, and you're absolutely right. It's devastating to those families in that community. In terms of FEMA, there is still a need, and I'll just put this on your radar, for individual assistance to help cover temporary housing. You mentioned that. It's a big issue throughout the country and certainly in California around affordable housing. And I know that FEMA does not have the number of trailers, and they're not on the production line in a way that we can get them to California as soon as they're needed. So there's still a need for temporary housing. Help and basic essentials like clothing and baby formula. And from HUD, if you can just pass this on, CDBG funding for permanent housing is a big issue. Crop insurance from USDA. And then from the SBA, we need business loans for small businesses that have been destroyed. So I thank you for that. On October 27th, through the Environment and Public Works Committee, which I'm also on, we sent a letter to FEMA and the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers asking for information about a timeline and the work that has been completed or is yet to be done as it relates to debris. So I'd like to get an answer to that, and if we can get that within the next week, I'd appreciate that. There are about 7 specific questions. But as you're aware, and has been mentioned here, there are millions of cubic feet of debris in Puerto Rico. And it is my understanding that we're looking at debris that is large. It ranges from rooftops to garage doors to refrigerators and couches, debris and that the people who live there cannot pick up and move. There's also been a compromise to the landfills in Puerto Rico that existed before the hurricanes hit and remain a problem. It is my understanding that FEMA plans to remove the debris, but I'm not clear on what the timeline is for actually getting that completed. Can you tell me what that plan is?
So each one of the events is extraordinarily different again, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to debris removal. For example, the California wildfires, if I may use that as an example. Because of the nature of the hazard, you first have to go through and make sure that you remove all the hazardous materials from personal property. Then, obviously, as you said, the number of deaths is projected to go up to over 80, and that's because we're still searching for remains in a very humane manner, trying to make sure that we go through the debris to find remains of the burning area. After all the environmental piece is done, and that we correctly go through to look for remains, then a lot of the debris contracting is done at the local level through private contracts. If those contracts fail or the governor requests me specifically, then we can mission assign the Army Corps of Engineers, which I believe you guys have been mission assigned in California, similar to also Puerto Rico. Debris in Florida was done differently. A large majority of that was done at the local level by debris contracts and pre-event contracts that they establish. So each one of these may have different timelines because of the types of debris, but like Puerto Rico.
Yeah, what is the timeline for Puerto Rico?
What's after that?
Senator, I don't have an exact timeline for Puerto Rico. We have just started scratching the surface on debris removal. We've run into some really interesting politics within the 78 municipalities that make up Puerto Rico in terms of how they are allowing us to gain access. And so we're in some significant negotiations. Many of the municipalities have come back and said, we don't really want you to do it. We'll take care of it ourselves. So we're going through that right now. I will respond to the letter that you sent with a much more definitive timeline than what I just gave you.
And then, and if you could also follow up on this point about what jurisdictions within Puerto Rico are hesitant to cooperate with your efforts, so that we can make sure that we do our part to figure out how to get some cooperation.
We'll do that, Senator.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Dr. Cadlick, my understanding is that the debris piles that are occurring in Puerto Rico, that they are wet from the recent rains. They are attracting pests that range from rodents to mosquitoes. And there is also a concern that the pets that are going there and the rodents that are going there are leaving great amounts of urine that is also seeping into the waterways. Can you talk for a moment about the health risks associated with this accumulating debris?
Well, ma'am, there are several issues that have to be dealt with in that. One is the moldy kind of debris that you'd be anticipating, and again, fungal growths that would be causing exacerbations for respiratory disease like asthma. Also, you'd be very concerned about some of the immunosuppressive effects of certain fungal growths that are out there, particularly with immunocompromised situations. Probably the biggest concern about debris piles is that you find people climbing on them, rooting around in them, so there's likely of lacerations, injuries, and infections, soft tissue injuries that come from that.
And bacterial diseases, is that
Yes,
correct?
ma'am, bacterial diseases.
can lead to
and that would
death.
be that. And the last one you didn't mention, but I'll mention because it's a matter of topical interest, is leptospirosis, which is endemic to Puerto Rico. Occurs typically during the rainy season, August through December. There have been some cases already been defined or declared, and a couple of deaths suspected with that. It's a disease that is remedied by antibiotic therapy. About a week after the landfall of the hurricane, we were working with the state epidemiologist, and again, everything we do is in support of the Department of Health on Puerto Rico, but basically making available courses of antibiotic treatment to basically treat anticipated levels of leptospirosis and other bacterial infections. Typically, leptospirosis occurs in about a couple hundred cases a year. We'd expect that to probably go higher than that because of the nature of the events. So we've provided several thousand courses of treatment for Puerto Rico. Beyond those kinds of circumstances, you'd be concerned about tetanus. We've also made available tetanus vaccines through CDC, and also have made available 24 environmental health officers to work with the Department of Puerto Rico as well as epidemiologists to track not only these kinds of environmental hazards, but also the cases that would be associated with them.
Mr. Chairman, I recognize my time is up. I would like, as a follow-up from each who has information about the incidents that we're also hearing of people in Puerto Rico drinking water from Superfund sites because of their desperation to get drinking water, and obviously there are obvious health risks, huge health risks associated with that. Thank you.
Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here and getting a chance to walk through this. I have a multitude of questions I'm going to try to blitz through in a short period of time. Mr. Long, let me ask you this. This just comes back to the preparation side of this. The Biggert Waters flood insurance program in 2012 required a report every 6 months on how we're doing on the debt, what's happening there, what process do we have to be able to work out of the flood insurance debt. The previous administration just stopped doing that report at the end of last year, so we don't have that really for 2 years. So it made it difficult coming into this year and trying to deal with obvious flood issues when we don't have a report for the last 2 years. Do you know when that is planned to restart? And I understand full well in the chaos of all it's trying to go with what's happening currently, that's probably going to be behind again, but do you know where that is in the process of restarting?
I do not, but we will follow up directly with you.
That would be helpful. You also mentioned in your testimony about trying to interact with private entities in the private sector on flood insurance. Do you have any specific ideas on that, things that you plan to be able to bring at the end of this?
While the NFIP program is underneath, my authorities, I'm not an insurance expert when it comes to fixing the NFIP. Going into Harvey, if I remember correctly, and this is, give or take, a couple million here, we were $24 billion in debt roughly. And then anytime you have a massive event, Katrina sent it into debt, Sandy sends it into debt, Harvey, Irma are going to send it into further debt, which you guys have recognized. We have to fix the business framework, and it's got to require a solution from the private sector. I think the private sector should drive a lot of the market. And, if we're going to continue to reward bad behavior by building in flood zones, then there needs to be actuarial risks that are involved. And I fully understand the affordability issues, but I also believe that we can't continue to allow conducting business under the same framework and continuing to go into debt. I don't want to run a program that goes into debt. Right. So I know what I don't know, and I know that we need the private sector support. I need your support to figure out the best way forward.
So let's work our way through this, which we understand will be months in the process and years in many places in the process. But we do need some help to be able to sit down at the table and be able to figure this out. We have ideas that we're bringing to it. Obviously, for the practitioners that are working through this are going to have specific ideas. We've got to deal with outside private sector insurance. We don't want to create a situation where private sector creates insurance policies, and then as soon as they have claims, they walk away from it.
Right.
That doesn't help those individuals. It doesn't help us, federal government. There has to be some ways to be able to establish some backstops that will work long-term and can provide some affordability. So I'd like to commit that in the days ahead, we're going to try to get some ideas worked out and look at a long-term plan. That's not going to be a year to resolve. It's going to be a decade or more to resolve, but we've got to be able to get started on this. I know with FEMA as well, there's been some interaction, and I'm not going to press you on this because we've talked about it before. But it is odd still in Florida and in Houston and in Puerto Rico that if a United Way facility has devastation or a zoo or a museum has devastation, they can engage with FEMA for help. But if a mosque, a synagogue, or a church has devastation, they cannot. All of those are nonprofits. But for those that are considered houses of worship, they can engage in the same way. I feel like, in reading the law from the 1990s, when Congress said that nonprofits would be included, that's all nonprofits. And I'll be able to continue that conversation in the days ahead with you on that. Sure. I know there's been some pushback, which I think is reasonable to be able to ask that question on that.
Sure.
General Jackson, by the way, your family's doing good?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, sir.
Thanks for the way you continue to be able to serve the nation. You mentioned a comment about half of the power generation in Puerto Rico is from wind and solar, and half of that is from fossil fuels. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, Senator.
So of those that are there, what remained? What was the most resilient? What is still working? What is redeemable of that?
Very interesting, Senator, that you asked that, because I was very surprised when I flew over the renewable sites, the solar and the wind. The actual blades of the wind farms were snapped off, and the solar panels were all smashed. And the actual power plants that held up the best were the typical standard power plants, be it the natural gas or coal-fired or heavy diesel or what have you. So just the structures themselves held up better than the renewables did, based on what I saw.
I'm not anti-renewable, to say the least, but I think part of the conversation that we have to have in helping Puerto Rico get back on its feet is to look at resiliency long-term. So I want us to be able to look at all of those things as we go through the process, and I know that'll be a common conversation around this horseshoe, and to be able to figure out how we actually get them back in place. I'm asking a question that I know is unfair, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you up front. We're all concerned about why Puerto Rico did not choose to do mutual aid for their power reconstruction. In Texas did, Florida did, other groups, when they've experienced it, they asked for mutual aid engaged. What have you been told why they didn't do that? Now, you can't tell me why. I'm only asking, what have you been told why they didn't ask for mutual aid? And Mr. Long, the question's coming to you as well next on that. So, General Jackson, what have you been told why they didn't request mutual aid?
Senator, I've been told that the reason that they did outreach at some point for mutual aid, but because it's a cost-shared arrangement and Puerto Rico is in the financial situation that they're in, that utility companies were hesitant to engage because there was no guarantee of cost-share payment. Now, that changed, I believe, when the cost-share arrangement was waived, and then they re-engaged. The public power utilities re-engaged. But by that time, PREPA had already reached out and had engaged with a sole source contract, and that's how that arrangement was started. That's what I've been told through multiple sources, but I obviously don't have any authority.
I understand, because again, I'm not asking what they did or why they made the decision, just what you're told. Mr. Long, is that the same thing you were told as well?
General Jackson's correct, and I agree with him. Many companies are not willing to engage until there's a guarantee of 100%.
Right.
And the bottom line is that I spoke with Governor Rosselló yesterday. They are going to re-engage the EMAC process for power support. I think specifically they're having conversations with the states of Florida and New York. And the goal is that my federal coordinating officer, Mike Byrne, has requested that PREPA make sure that we are unified with the Army Corps so that we're not working in separate streams, but we're working together in a consolidated effort.
We will follow up with your staff, because I have another question that's a process issue that we'll have to just talk through, and that is, at times when FEMA can't get it done with contracts, you're punting to Army Corps of Engineers to be able to handle contracts. And what I'd be interested to know is the contracting process. Right. Which one takes longer, which one's more efficient, which one has greater cost. At times, there is some overlap in between to who's got debris removal, at what level FEMA can handle it, at what level they need to be able to hand it off. For us, that's going to be helpful just to be able to know, because those are federal dollars there, which one's more efficient. Do we need to buffer one up to be able to correct another one?
Can I answer the question? We do not typically contract to rebuild power grids. We mission assign the Army Corps of Engineers, who handles the contracts directly to get the job done. The best case scenario is the example of Florida. Florida Power and Light controls their destiny when it comes to restoring their own power grid and then activating mutual aid, and then FEMA basically serves in a supportive federal role to reimburse those actions.
Yeah, my question won't be specifically on power. It'll be on all contractors, whether
Sure.
it be debris removal
Okay.
or whatever it may be. When we have to hire individual contractors, who handles that more efficiently? How does that actually work? Which one takes longer and such? So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heidkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague from New Hampshire for letting me go first. I have a few questions about the Navy ship Comfort. According to the Department of Defense, the Comfort has one of the largest trauma facilities in the United States, is equipped as well as any kind of floating hospital can be equipped. It is capable of treating 200 patients per day with 250 beds available. But yet we hear over and over again that there are people going without medical treatment. Despite that capability and the staff of over 800 trained personnel, the Comfort's treated only 100 patients 17 days after arriving in Puerto Rico on October 3rd and 30 days after Hurricane Maria made landfill. Dr. Cadillac, how many patients have been treated on the Comfort so far that you're familiar with? And can you elaborate
Sure,
on the
ma'am.
challenges that we've had getting patients to the Comfort?
Sure, I think in the last count was 121 as a result of that. But ma'am, before you make a judgment on that, let me just explain what was the approach using the Comfort as it related to its high acuity capabilities, which you're correct in saying there are 200 beds, but there are more importantly 50 intensive care unit beds on that boat. And that really was the capability we needed, because quite frankly, if you looked at the events on the island, we had a level 1 trauma center at Centro Medico, which was the east side of the island.
So how many of the patients that were treated aboard the Comfort were actually ICU patients?
Were high acuity patients.
Yeah.
Well, if I recall correctly, over 60. I can get you that number though, ma'am.
Yeah.
But the point was, is we used that as a floating intensive care unit, primarily in the basis when we were trying.
So
to
it's your judgment that the Comfort has been fully utilized for the need in Puerto Rico?
What it did was cover a critical bet that we had, which was based on the risk that hospitals would lose power because the majority of them, in fact, all of them were on generator for a period of time. Now we have 70% back on the grid. But for the time being, when the hospitals were on generators and the risk of failure before we could put backup generators, we used the Comfort as a place where we could take high acuity patients, transport them by helicopter, by rotary wing medevac helicopter.
I get all that, but I think anybody who looks at this, and maybe it's just the news, and I will turn to you, Administrator Long, who looks at the news and says, look, there's this huge medical need, people going without treatment, people at risk of losing their life. We have this incredible asset. This is an island. It's not like, the United States of America where you might have something 3,000 miles away. Why does it seem to be, to me, underutilized?
So I appreciate the question. I understand the frustrations of the questions. The goal is always, anytime you move medically fragile people, patients out of a hospital, you take a risk at them surviving that move to begin with. So the goal is to stabilize the situation in the hospitals. And there was a tremendous effort to do that because what we ran into was not only hospitals operating without power, but making sure that the generator actually worked, getting it fuel on a regular basis, and then maintenance of the generator ongoing. These generators aren't designed to run for months. And so what we did is we initiated the Comfort, and Bob, you could probably talk about the timeline it takes to actually do that. It's about an 8-day process to even turn the keys on, fuel the boat, get everybody staffed to even mobilize and go to the island. It's a long process, but the bottom line is we basically set up a 911 system, as I understand, to where in 2 or 3 cases, a hospital generator would fail. We would move the most medically fragile patients via helicopter from the hospital to the Comfort. I would argue that it was being utilized very well, and again, the goal is try to get the hospitals to operate. We're always going to be second guessed on everything, but try to get the hospitals to operate and serve patients where they are.
Administrator Long, I know Senator Tester hit on this, but one of the concerns that I have, given what now has landed on your plate, is that all of our talk about mitigation, all of our talk about preparedness will take a back seat to just dealing with the disasters that you've been handed. We all know, based on experiences with Katrina, with Sandy, this is not, we're here for a month and then we leave. What are you going to do, or what recommendations would you make to us in terms of staffing so that you have the capability of actually looking at mitigation and not just dealing with the crisis?
Sure, and I've been concerned about that because my staff and the coordination through the federal departments. I mean, tens of thousands of people have been deployed. I mean, if you look at the actual number that's been deployed, starting with Harvey, it's been unprecedented, and I don't have to say that. And unfortunately, I do feel like we're losing a lot of the successes that have actually been implemented as a result of the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. A lot of things went right. A lot of things went right. So that we don't lose Puerto Rico, I plan to do an after-action report to make sure that we understand where we are versus where we need to be, specifically when it comes not only to Puerto Rico, but island territories.
Yeah.
I want to go back and hit the reset button. In regards to staff specifically, eventually I would like to change the entire hiring process of the Federal Emergency Management Agency to adopt a more FBI-style academy approach. I would also like to expand my staff out of those regional offices to the states and islands to make sure that we're a part of that discussion every day.
I think you received an incredible amount of bipartisan support, in part because we understood what role you played in the look back on Katrina. We hope that you will be equally critical of the work that you've done as administrator, but that you also will collaborate with us in terms of what you need. I think Senator Tester said it best. You can't look at this and then understand this continues and think that we don't have a huge challenge where we need to look at all hands on deck. What are the requirements that we want to impose on states so that they understand what their role is going to be, so they're not overly dependent on the federal government, but that this work is seamless. And so I look forward to additional conversations with you and to understanding what you need. But we can't give you what you need if you don't ask.
And we would be happy to put that as together. And if I may, each citizen is responsible for their own individual preparedness. We do not have a true culture of preparedness in this country, and we need to hit the reset button and look at how we, partner with the Department of Education and give people critical skills. I mean, Gail McGovern with the Red Cross said that 1 in 4 of us is going to have to perform CPR, to someone else at any given time. Are we giving people those Boy Scout type skills, as well as tangible things to understand that they may be the true first responder for an active shooter event, or if they're your neighbor's house has collapsed upon them? That many times citizens are the first true responder, and we have to start dedicating our public awareness and cultural preparedness campaigns to doing that, as well as figuring out what the states need.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for your hard work and all of you working under very, very difficult circumstances. We hope that Congress can be an effective partner for you.
And Senator Heinekamp, real quick before you leave, you may not have been here, but one of the action items I'm taking away from here is literally that state-by-state, territory-by-territory assessment. Who has prepared themselves? What is that? What is the current state, so we can determine something, mitigation. We will definitely follow that up with a hearing.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Grand Forks flood was a devastating event. We all pulled our state disaster plan off, blew the dust off of it, and realized that we needed to take that process more seriously. So nothing like a state disaster the caliber of this to realign all of our thinking.
Yep. So we'll work with you on that. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all to the witnesses for being here today and for the work you do on behalf of our country. We are very, very grateful. I've got 3 basic questions, and so I'm going to try to move through them quick so we can get to all of them. Administrator Long, I want to again thank you for being here today and also for briefing several senators on a call on September 28th in which you updated us on the U.S. government's relief efforts in Puerto Rico. On this call, you said that the airports and seaports were all heavily damaged. You also added that the road networks were in many cases impassable and that you lacked trucks and personnel to be able to effectively distribute the ample relief supplies you had waiting on pallets. So when did FEMA and the Department of Defense first make the assessment that the damage to the airports and seaports would encumber the delivery of relief supplies?
Almost immediately, and that was the logistical complexity of being able to put forward the humanitarian mission. All of those ports were damaged, but it wasn't just the ports. It was the air traffic control systems that also guide those in. It was...
So it was almost immediate. So when did you make the determination that you would need the full capabilities of the United States military to be able to distribute resources based on that assessment? And when did you first ask the Department of Defense for the type of assets that were eventually provided for the relief response?
And if I may defer here, but let me be clear. We engaged the Department of Defense before Maria hit, and so there were a ton of assets on the island, before the storm hit. But you can only put so many people and equipment on an island, or you expose it to the storm, and it becomes useless after the fact. So it's a balancing game. But if I may defer.
Sure. Go ahead.
My name is Bob Saley.
Right. Make sure your microphone's on, please.
There it is, sorry. Hurricane Irma came through first. As you know, it hit St. Thomas and St. John, did a lot of damage. We actually had DoD assets in the area. We had the U.S.
So I'm just going to interrupt for a second, because on the September 28th call with FEMA and other agencies, the DoD representative stated that the U.S. Northern Command was working on a plan to mobilize an additional sustainment force to Puerto Rico. Now, that's 8 days after the hurricane hit. Additionally, according to FEMA's website, on October 1st, U.S. Northern Command delivered approximately 310,000 meals, 150,000 liters of water, generators, tarps, additional sustainment units, and leading components of aviation command and control. Given that it was apparent from FEMA and DoD assessment that both the airports and seaports of Puerto Rico were heavily damaged and that this would cause immense distribution challenges, why did it take until October 1st to deliver aviation command and control to the island? And why on September 28th was the U.S. Northern Command still working to finalize its plans to deliver a sustainment force? And when did the sustainment force arrive?
So, ma'am, to answer that question, again, there's concurrent activity always in these events. As I indicated, we had Navy ships in the area, the U.S. Kearsarge, the Oak Hill. They had helicopters. They were doing search and rescue capabilities. Simultaneously, U.S. Transcom, which is responsible for strategic airlift and providing C-17s and C-5s, was flying in assessment teams for airfields. As the administrator pointed out, a number of those airfields had severe damage, no navigation aids, no radars, those kinds of things. That equipment had to be put in place. All of this was happening well before the 28th, ma'am. I don't know where the impression got. There was
I'll tell you what, the impression came from the questions we asked on a conference call on September 28th. So what I would ask as a follow-up, we'll of course have these letters to you directly, is some real specifics here, because I think all of us were concerned that 8 days after the hurricane hit, it seemed like we were still having to suggest in that call that the United States military was going to be necessary to help get some supplies distributed because of the impassability of transportation infrastructure. I do, just because I have a couple of minutes left, want to move on to one other question to Administrator Long. Last week, ProPublica posted a story that stated that FEMA was declining to publicly release a document drafted several years ago that detailed how FEMA would respond to a major hurricane in Puerto Rico. According to ProPublica, FEMA started drafting the plans known as the Hurricane Annex after the lack of preparation in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. ProPublica also found similar plans posted on DoD's website for Hawaii, which detailed an 85-step process to restore electricity on Hawaii in the event of a hurricane. So why is FEMA not releasing this document to the public? And could you please commit to making it public? And if not, will you please articulate what was in the Hurricane Annex and what steps you followed in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria?
Sure, Senator. We gave it to the committee last night, apparently.
Okay.
I was just briefed, but I was unaware of the issue.
All right.
I'd be happy to follow up with you directly.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And in that case, I will also just, before yielding back the remainder of my time, let you all know that, well, actually, we have a minute. So instead of giving this to the record, I did want to touch on the U.S. Virgin Islands and where we are in terms of power restoration and tourism, because perhaps even more so than Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands economy fundamentally depends on the ability of the islands to host tourists from all over the world. The Virgin Islands suffered a direct hit from not only Hurricane Maria, but Hurricane Irma as well. These storms knocked out the power across these islands, and the islands cannot expect to begin to reestablish its tourism economy without the restoration of power, to say the least. Yet, after more than a month, the U.S. Virgin Islands report that less than a third of the territories have power up and running. So what steps are FEMA and DoD taking to restore full power to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and what is FEMA's current estimate of when 100% of the islands will have power?
Yep. So excellent point. You know, the Virgin Islands were hit equally as hard as Puerto Rico, and the bottom line is they're basically in the same approach, but there's two different approaches being taken to restore the power, as I understand it. So where we proactively push forward the Army Corps of Engineers in Puerto Rico, the power authority that represents the Virgin Islands is in control and conducting their own contracts and leading their power restoration. But if the last number I saw was that power should be restored by, December timeframe as well. But here again, that's just an estimate.
Okay. Well, thank you again for your participation. I appreciate it very much. And Mr. Chair, thank you.
Sure. Senator Hassel, let me just brief you what I know about that report you referenced. The annex is jointly owned by FEMA and the state of Puerto Rico. It was not released because Puerto Rico did not give FEMA permission to share it with the media. We got it as for official use only document, which we're happy to share with you. But until Puerto Rico agrees to release it, it can't be released to the general public.
Well, I would appreciate to see it. I'm glad we have it, and I'll follow up with you further. Thank you.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. Thank you for testifying today. And Administrator Long, it's good to see you again. I got to tell you, folks out in eastern Montana, we're very grateful with the fact that you listened to our pleas when we had some devastating wildfires that took out much of Garfield County. And I think we've seen sometimes the criteria for dealing with a rural situation, rural environment, which much of Montana is, can be a bit different than a disaster that hits one of our urban centers. And I want to thank you for your responsiveness and, importantly, for your action. And the folks out in eastern Montana appreciate that a lot. We had a terrible wildfire season in Montana this past summer. In fact, Secretary Perdue listed the top wildfires in the nation as ranked by dollars spent to fight them. We spent over $2 billion fighting wildfires this season, and still not over yet. But the number one fire in the nation was in Montana, the Lolo Peak Fire. The number 3 fire in the nation was in Montana, the Rice Ridge Fire, just in terms of dollars. So it was one of those terrible seasons. And again, thank you, Mr. Long, for what you did in response to help us there in Montana. Much of the discussion here today has been on Puerto Rico and the devastating hurricane. And the loss of the grid. Mr. Long, I will tell you, I was a bit surprised when I heard the story of a small contractor of 2 people. Most had never heard of, including myself, being awarded a contract that was worth $300 million to rebuild Puerto Rico's power grid. In the contract, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, claimed it met all the guidelines and regulation set forth by FEMA, and that it had been reviewed also by FEMA. Would you explain FEMA's involvement in the contract process?
Sure.
And how you monitor federal dollars before they're allocated?
Sure. So let me be clear. The Whitefish contract was not a FEMA contract. PREPA entered into this contract in late September. We were notified several weeks after the fact. Our lawyers, there's not a lawyer inside FEMA that would have ever agreed to the language that was in that contract to begin with, so let me be very clear about that. We raised the red flag and basically saying, you know, we're not sure this is a sole source contract or a competitive rate. There were many things wrong. There was also language in there that would suggest that the federal government would never audit Whitefish, which there's not a lawyer inside FEMA that would ever agree to that type of language. So the bottom line is that as I understand, not $1 has gone towards that contract from FEMA. And what we're doing is rectifying to make sure that PREPA has not requested any funding for that reimbursement effort. We have a lot of work to do when it comes to grant monitoring at all levels of government. It's not just FEMA, but it's at the state and the local governments when it comes to the grantees that are there. We ask them to always follow pre-disaster bid laws and policies, because when you change those policies after a disaster, it's going to hang you up in an audit. We also ask them to follow emergency bid laws when it comes to the procurement process according to 2 CFR, okay? And so we have a lot of work to do when it comes to training and ensuring the grant monitoring, but in that case, that was not our contract.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'll be interested as you dig into that one for what the learnings are from that situation and how we can improve that process. It's always one of the concerns. When we have a disaster, of course, we want to move quickly. People are in need, people are dying, but we also want to make sure we're accountable, efficient, and there's oftentimes opportunity for a tremendous amount of waste in some kind of in a situation we're throwing billions of dollars at some of these disasters. So I'll look forward to that. Follow what you learned from that, Mr. Long, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Long, one of my constituents volunteered through the AFL-CIO to provide assistance in Puerto Rico. He was there from October 4th through the 18th. And he certainly said the citizens remarked how grateful they were for the assistance that was being provided by his group, because no one else seemed to be there to help, was at least his experience on the ground. I know a group of National Nurses United had a similar experience and also made some of the same comments to me. So it seems to be a common perception that assistance wasn't reaching the people in need in Puerto Rico, that there were some distribution problems, that stuff may have gone to distribution centers, but it wasn't getting out, actually out to the individuals. So my question is, why were we hearing that from volunteers, and do you believe that was an issue?
I can't speak to the gentleman's or to the constituents in direct experience, but I can explain the logistical complexities that we faced when it came to the humanitarian issues of getting meals and water out. As we were discussing earlier, all the ports were damaged. It took us time to not only rebuild the air traffic control system, but open up the ports. We pre-staged quite a bit of food in our Caribbean area division before the storm. You can only stage so much on the island. We also checked with Governor Rosselló and the school systems. They had a lot of food inside the shelters, multiple days of food in each one of the school shelters that were there. So we tried to put as much food forward as possible before the storm hit. When it came to the diminished capacity, obviously the state and local governments, they were disaster survivors. As we began to push in the food to the island, we had to quickly mobilize 10 regional distribution hubs where we would fly it in, set up and stage all the commodities, and then force the food and water to each one of these distribution hubs. We had to establish communication with all 78 mayors because there was no survivable comms that were there. We started communicating and sending liaisons to mayors and making sure that we got the commodities to them directly. If they couldn't get it to the final mile, then we would actually airdrop if there were isolation issues. And I don't know how many isolation-based airdrops we've made, but they're continuing today. Did we get to everybody? It's hard to say. Part of it was the lack of communications and the ability that we recognized that people weren't sure where to go. And in some cases, what I saw with my own eyes, I went to Utuado in the central portions, mountainous regions of Puerto Rico, where some of the folks in the isolated communities are being really resilient, and they're not choosing to come to the areas where food and water is. And so the bottom line is, I know that this is one of the, I feel certain that this is probably one of the largest humanitarian missions that we've ever conducted in the United States, and there are tens of millions of meals and water that were pushed, and there is a lot of assets on there. I've also asked the Office of Inspector General to look into how our commodities were being used by some of the mayors as well, and it's my understanding that the FBI may be looking at that as well.
Well, I appreciate your candor, and I know this was an incredibly difficult task that you were involved in and continued to be involved in probably for quite some time, and I appreciate your efforts on that. And you've been very candid in this hearing today, and that's refreshing to have that kind of candor, because the idea is that we have to learn, celebrate what we did right and learn from our mistakes to be ready for the future. But what would you be your assessment in Puerto Rico on a scale of 1 to 10 in your expert capacity as to FEMA's ability to meet the disaster?
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do. One of the first things I want to do is come back and have an after action. I want to figure out the grant funding that went to FEMA, or excuse me, went to Puerto Rico. What did we get in return of that? I want to make sure that, are the commodity capabilities that are on the island are obviously too small. How do we set up island territories to be more self-sufficient, that it doesn't require a massive DoD mission to be able to fly these things in? There are a whole host of improvements that need to be made, and I recognize that, and I'll be dedicated to making sure that we find out and doing an exhaustive after action. And if there are issues where I need the Senate's support, I'll be definitely coming back to you to ask for that support to change the way that we do business in the future. Trust me, I do not want to go through this event again.
Right.
As much as anybody else.
Well, and I asked the 1 to 10, that may be tough for you to do, but perhaps for the average Puerto Rican, how would they rate the federal government's response? You've been on the ground an awful lot. I appreciate that. From
Senator,
1 to 10, what do you think they would say?
With all due respect, obviously people have different experiences. I'm not interested in giving myself a grade or rating each other. Quite honestly, that'd be the only thing that the media picked up today about in this congressional hearing, if that's the case. Could we have done better? Did we move as fast as people want? Obviously, in some cases, no. But if you look at in the Miami Herald this morning, the State Department representative, Luis Rivera, read his assessment and go talk to the mayors. Go talk to the 78 mayors and all of them and get your assessment from them, please, because for me to sit back and say we did things perfectly, I know we didn't. Of course, there's things that I wish had gone better or things that I had known going into that event, obviously. But the bottom line is that I know at the end of the day, we pushed as hard as we could. Our partners pushed as hard as we could, and we moved as fast as the situation allowed. And this is one of the most logistically complex disasters that this nation has faced.
Well, you mentioned talking to local mayors. Actually leads into the second question I have, is that, as you know, Isabella County and Midland County, Michigan, experienced some catastrophic flooding this summer, one of the long list of issues that you had that were on your plate this year. And I heard from county administrators, emergency responders, as well as impacted constituents in general, that they were very appreciative of the work that FEMA did to help them in responding to that flooding. But that said, they also thought that FEMA could have done a much better job of coordinating with local officials at the beginning of the response efforts. And in our experiences, I think, as you mentioned, upfront coordination with local authorities can go a long way to facilitating that kind of response. But that's what I heard from my folks in Michigan, although, again, being supportive of your efforts, but thinking that was a lack in FEMA's efforts was the local coordination with local officials. What do you think we should be doing to better that type of cooperative effort?
Personally, I would like to expand our footprint. I would like to change our footprint and graduate beyond the regional offices. I would like to develop, what we call state integration teams that are multifaceted, that are there working with the state every day and being able to drive out to your local counties and doing things such as approving mitigation plans with having had it to come all the way back through the region or up to headquarters. I'd like to change the workforce. I would like to make our reservist cadre more in line with what the National Guard approach is, so that you can have a full-time job, step away from your job to go support FEMA in a disaster without losing that daytime job. I would like to change our entire workforce program to be more like an FBI model. We're the only public safety agency in the country that doesn't have a true academy-style model of hiring and graduating people through our system so that we're training everybody to be the next federal coordinating officer that understands all aspects of this program. I'm frustrated by our hiring processes. I would like to rewrite the book on how we do that and how we maintain and utilize disaster reservists who are critically important to our mission.
Well, I think those are all really good thoughts, so I look forward to working with you on those issues going forward. Thank you, Mr. Long.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Peters. One of the concerns I have, just kind of listening to some of the dialogue here, is I don't want to see FEMA be the primary responder here. I believe the role is to support state and local governments, to support them. And the more we expect out of FEMA, first of all, we're going to spread them thinner. And now you're going to have, again, a one-size-fits-all model, and it's going to be the federal government that's going to have to decide where all these assets have to be deployed ahead of time. States and local governments need to understand that. They need to understand their risks. They need to be held responsible as well. And so I think we need to be very careful as we go down this road and say, well, hey, how come FEMA didn't do the job perfectly? And listen to people's complaints, oh, they didn't coordinate quite as well as we would like to. Again, it's to help them. FEMA's role is to help, to be subordinate to that. So I think it's incredibly important. I've only got one other point I want to make because it was pretty interesting in talking to you, Administrator Long. We have so much foodstuffs and water, to a certain extent, down in Puerto Rico. You point out the fact the private sector is now asking you, we need to reestablish ourselves. If our population is going to rely on FEMA and the federal government to provide meals, we're not going to have the private sector firing back up and have grocery stores operating properly. Can you just kind of talk about what?
Sure, you're absolutely right. So the goal is always to get the retail industry back up and running, and the last number I saw was roughly 90%. Obviously, as the retail industry comes up, we should be drawing down on the commodity mission. In many cases, the mayors have asked us to stop the flow of food, but continue the water issues until the water system is fully back online. And so it's a constant communication battle every day, or not battle, it's just constant good communication every day with the mayors to understand what the need is, where the private sector market is. But as we go forward, I do think that we have to form tighter bonds with the private sector and understand the modeling to see this not only in Puerto Rico, but in California or Florida or Texas, to say, here's where the market is, here's where the gas stations are coming back online, so that we can tailor the response day in and day out.
I think your name describes what your function is, Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's not federal recovery. It's not long-term recovery. There's going to be other federal agencies, but hopefully more state and local governments that are going to really take up the responsibility of recovering in their local jurisdictions. With that, Senator Carper.
Just to follow on what the chairman's saying, the last 100 years, 33 Category 5 hurricanes. This fall, 2, within a matter of weeks of one another. And we've seen this very interesting chart that the chairman has, very instructive chart that the chairman has shown that indicates what's happening in terms of frequencies of this kind of crazy weather that we're faced with. And I would just, this is a shared responsibility, but I would feel that we had failed in our responsibilities collectively if we simply rebuild help rebuild an electric grid in Puerto Rico that is just as vulnerable, that is just as energy inefficient, and that is just as polluting as what they largely have faced in past decades. I think we'd really have missed an opportunity. Our colleague, Senator Peters, asked you, Mr. Long, to evaluate or maybe provide a grade of some sort to the work of FEMA so far. We have a saying in Delaware: when a little fighter, we're a little state, but when a little fighter is fighting a big fighter and wins, we say that the little fighter fights above his or her weight. And I think FEMA is punching above its weight, and we applaud that. I think the grade to be assigned is probably incomplete, because there's plenty of work still to do, and I think you know that. Richard Nixon used to, I'm the only Democrat I know that quotes Richard Nixon, but Nixon used to say, the only people who don't make mistakes are people who don't do anything. Think about that. Tom Carper always says, everything I do, I know I can do better. And if it isn't perfect, make it better. So that's our goal. We're not, perfection is probably not achievable, but we certainly want to head in that direction, regardless of whether we sit on this side of the dais or your side. Senator Peters also talked about the sort of the interaction interface between state and local folks and FEMA. And I would, this would be one short question for you, Administrator Long, but there's been some feedback that there's been a disconnect between the governor of government of Puerto Rico, FEMA, the Corps of Army Corps of Engineers, various contractors on the ground regarding roles and responsibilities, who is doing what activity. I don't think that's to be totally surprising. But what are you doing to ensure that a cohesive effort that supports the governor of Puerto Rico, who's ultimately in charge of recovery efforts? Could you just respond to that?
Sure, it's a great question. Clear communication is the line, is what's needed to succeed. And I speak to Governor Rosselló on multiple times a week on a regular basis. But what we do, obviously, to have wide area management capability over the magnitude of everything that's happened, is I have to rely very heavily on federal coordinating officers. And for the example of Puerto Rico, Mike Byrne is my federal coordinating officer. Technically, he's appointed by the president if you look at the Stafford Act. And so I have federal coordinating officers over each one of these disasters that I stay in touch with. But I also reach out very regularly to Governor Rosselló. And I got to tell you, every day that man goes to work trying to do the best that he can for Puerto Rico, and I have deep respect for the governor and what he's trying to do and work through, and he's facing the most complex disaster of many of them. And so the communication's good, but I have to set up Recovery Command on site and allow the decisions to be made on site rather than all the way back up here in D.C. Incident command decisions have to be made closest to where the disaster is, not up here.
Yeah, sometimes when I see adult children of my friends who've gone on to do great things with their life, I say they picked the right parents. And I would say to Ricky Rosselló, the governor now, that he picked the right parents. And my old colleague, Pedro Rosselló, with whom I served from 93 to 2001 as governor. I want to ask one question for each of you, and then I'm done. But the question is this. Just name one thing. Each of just name one thing that folks on my side of the aisle, those with whom we serve here in the Senate and the House, one thing that we need to be doing to enable you and your folks to do a better job. Just one thing, please. And we'll just start, if I can, with Mr. Cadler. Are you an Air Force Academy graduate?
Yes, sir, I am.
Navy Sleuths Air Force. Good for you.
Sir, you beat us in football, though.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir. I think one of the issues that came up was about streamlining processes and effects and activities. For the health care, we talk about minutes and hours, really depending life and death decision and being able to intervene positively. And I think one of the areas that Congress should look at is dependencies. Dependencies affect all the activities here. What makes it more streamlined, what makes it more efficient, what makes it more, most importantly, effective. And those are the areas that I would identify as most important.
Good, thanks. General Jackson, thank you.
Senator, thanks for the question. Since we've spoken mostly about the power grid restoration, I think that's where my comment would come from. And that is, I think if Congress can decide what end state looks like, there's multiple requirements that could be out there, multiple things that could be done. They all cost different amounts of money. But what does end state look like, and what does the nation want us to do? Whether it's what the Corps is doing or what whoever will do in terms of what the power generation will look like, what the transmission lines and such will look like. Being able to craft what end state looks like with the resources to match would be my recommendation.
Good. Thanks so much.
Senator, thanks for the question. I'd say continue to support the men and women in uniform. Specifically, the Department of Defense did enormous work in all of these hurricanes. As you know, the number of Navy ships, the strategic airlift that was involved in this, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, active reserve and guard. That made a huge difference in each one of these hurricanes. The Defense Department has evolved greatly in that responsibility of supporting civil authorities, and that needs to continue because it makes all the difference to our citizens.
Yeah. Well, when I'm talking with folks from different armed services other than the Navy, sometimes there's a friendly inter-service rivalry, as you know, not just on the football field. But I always say to them at the end of those conversations, different uniforms, same team. And it's a great team. Administrator Long.
Externally for the entire country, I think survivable communications is something that we have to address with the private sector. We become more and more vulnerable every day as we go to digital networks. And when you don't have redundant systems or mitigated systems designed to handle all hazards, then it creates panic. And as we've seen, we basically just went through a complete and total communication blackout for an island, and it creates a lot of panic, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misinformation. And that was incredibly frustrating. So I think we have a lot of work to do for survivable comms. Internally, fix the NFIP, do more pre-disaster mitigation, and let's come back to the drawing board on the disaster, on the DRF, the Disaster Relief Fund.
Thanks to all of you and the teams you lead. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my final comment, I appreciate my colleagues like this chart. There's a number of factors that are built into the dramatic increase in the FEMA declarations. One of them is just so we declare more disasters as a FEMA disaster. And my concern is that, I won't say the word abdication, but certainly local and state authorities are happy to have the federal government spend their money and be responsible for a greater share of these things that are occurring within their state. So I mean, that's part of the factor here. But again, I want to thank all of you. I think your efforts have been extraordinary. I would give you a pretty high grade, personally. Again, this is unprecedented what has happened here. You get 51 inches in any place. There's no way to plan for that. That's going to create a lot of destruction. You get Category 5 hurricanes going over an entire island, even one that's in the Caribbean that, you know, is used to hurricanes. That's going to cause disaster. You just don't snap your fingers and alleviate all pain and suffering. So again, I think the men and women that have worked with you have done an extraordinary job, and I thank all of them, and I thank all of you. And with that, this hearing record will remain open for 15 days until November 15th, 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.